Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we want to have a discussion on how we can save America. How we can save the United States. Now look, if you watch the mainstream media today, you will see the likes of Don Lemon and other far left-wing extremists propagating misinformation about what is occurring in Minnesota. Look, these individuals that are being detained and removed from the United States are not supposed to be here. They entered the country illegally, disregarding American law, and now have become, for the most part, a burden upon the U.S. citizenry. That is what is happening, and they are being lawfully removed. The federal government, if you enter the United States illegally, can remove you. And that is what is happening. You're being removed. But this goes much, much further than the actual immigration policy in terms of certain presidents who will enforce immigration law and certain presidents who will not enforce immigration law and issue mandates towards our border protection forces and internal security forces that protect the United States from the entry of illegal criminals. And those forces are essentially stood down, and they are not able to do their jobs. In the last 4 years, we have seen quite literally millions upon millions of illegal aliens enter the United States. They must be removed. But the saving of the United States goes much, much, much deeper than just removing illegal aliens, which must be done. And I've talked about this before, and I will say it until blue in the face. The school system of the United States, the grade school and the university and the colleges, they are creating the most problems for the United States. That has to be fixed. There needs to be, again, an internal audit of those persons that are charged with teaching the next generation of leaders and workers and what have you, and voters. That's another topic I also want to address in this episode as well. Voters. But that has to be fixed. If you are a teacher and in your classroom there are rainbow flags and there is leftist propaganda that ultimately despises the United States, then you should be removed from being able to teach. If you want to create a private school that you fund yourself, and you want individuals to go to that school, great, fine, you can do that. But public schools need to be audited for this left-wing lunacy that is happening. If you don't have an American flag in your classroom, then you probably should not be teaching. If you have a rainbow flag or you fly an American flag upside down in protest because you are for sexual nationalism or you are for the illegal entry of millions upon millions of illegals into the country, then you need to be terminated. You need to go bye-bye. Now, which leads me to another point. Should this person even be voting? Are there certain individuals in the United States, some folks would call it the un-United States, should they even have the ability to vote? Now look, let's go back in history. At one point, there was something known as the Property Qualification Clause. What did that mean? So early in American history, the founding fathers and the leaders understood the concept of being a stakeholder. If you are a lazy, asocial bum who lives off the public dole, and back in the 1700s, the early 1800s, you couldn't do that because you would perish for lack of nutrition. Darwinism. Social Darwinism. So the Property Qualification Clause is a clause or rule by which those without property land or those without property of a set appraised value or those without income of a set value are not enfranchised to vote in elections or stand for election, to hold office, or from other activities. Should we have another look at that? Now, I do believe that there could be an alternative pathway to allowing more people to vote. An alternative pathway beyond the scope of owning property or being a reasonably flourishing member of society, having a job. What else could happen? What else could we do to ensure that individuals were in a sound state of mind, respected the government, respected the country, and as a society we could say, okay, you can vote. You can be a stakeholder. Well, I think some sort of civil service. You know, at one point we had a conscripted military. With the onset of World War II, even going into Vietnam, we had universal conscription. If there was a war on, conscription occurred. Now we know that a all-volunteer military is a much more effective military, much more motivated military than a conscripted military. So I don't want to see the concept of an all-volunteer military necessarily go away. I would like to avoid that sort of universal conscription where we can maintain a quality of force. So in terms of the military, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, that obviously should stay a fully volunteer force. Even the National Guard can stay a fully volunteer force. I would oppose mandating, say, the Army or the National Guard go back to conscription, unless we were in a really nasty war in which we were required to do that. I do, however, think you could create an auxiliary force, maybe call it the Home Guard, that you would not necessarily have to conscript individuals, but you would entice individuals through having the ability to vote. And you know what? If they get out of grade school or they flunk out of grade school or what have you, and they decide that they do not want to do this and they do not want to vote, then great, don't allow them to vote. Don't give them that right of citizenship. But there should be a pathway, again, the concept of the home guard, where you join the service and you act as maybe an auxiliary force for interior projects, for policing the border, for acting as an auxiliary force in terms of facilitating certain military operations. Maybe they act as cooks, maybe they act as project engineers for, again, internal improvements, roadway construction, things like that. And you serve in that capacity for 2 to 4 years. And then what that does is that then allows you quite possibly a couple of things. It allows you full citizenship rights. It gives you the right to vote. And then obviously if you wanted to join the military, you could do that. That would be a pathway for the right of citizenship and voting. I am against the concept of allowing foreign nationals into the U.S. military and then giving them the right of citizenship. These are for born in the United States citizens. Then you can have the privilege of joining the military. You could have the privilege of serving in a volunteer home guard, which would give you the right to then vote. You would have that ability. That will also give you the ability to be employed within the scope of possibly state and or federal governments. Again, the qualifying factor would be that initial service, that oath of loyalty to the United States. Is there an age, is there a time that I believe we should go back to as a nation state? And I would say, in all probability, we need to look at maybe the 1950s, the 1940s. We have to reflect back to that time. And maybe, as we look back to that time and we institute policies that are designed to protect America and foster patriotism instead of anti-Americanism that we see now in the school system. Again, the most important thing right now that could be done to save the United States is to clean up the school systems. The next is making the right to vote not a right to vote, a privilege to vote. Again, you can do that through the ownership of property, being a stakeholder, or joining a military service or a semi-civil, semi-paramilitary home guard that not necessarily would not have a completely kinetic aspect to it, meaning it's a designed military type organization. That organization could also be designed to better the United States. But if you do that, and you're able to pass a citizenship test out of grade school, then that is the pathway for you as a full citizen. That would give you the right to vote. The privilege to vote. I keep saying right to vote. The privilege to vote. Are there people right now in our society that are actively participating in our quote-unquote democracy that should not be participating in our quote-unquote democracy? Absolutely. Absolutely. There are a great number of individuals right now that actively seek the destruction of the United States. They inherently believe that the United States is a bad thing and should be disrupted and or destroyed. And they're voting. And they're voting with those ideals. They are voting with the intent of putting persons in power that will disrupt or destroy the United States. Case in point, Zoran, the destroyer of cities in New York. That individual is in power because New York City is rife with anti-Americanism. It is rife with people who probably should not be living in New York City. The New York City school system is rife with quote-unquote teachers. I call them indoctrination specialists that are not teaching young people. They are indoctrinating young people into the ideas of anti-Americanism and left-wing, far left-wing philosophy. I think right now in terms of, I know right now that in terms of cultural Marxism, in terms of cultural liberalization, we are seeing things right now, even if you were to go back to the Soviet Union, the early stages of actual Leninism and then eventually Stalinism. You are seeing things right now that here in the United States, in terms of the transvestite movement and this asocial movement that has propagated the left, that was not necessarily on the scale in terms of the old Soviet Union that you would see now here in the ununited States. You're seeing a lot more of that. Now look, what's interesting is the early stages, mid stages, late stages, Spanish Civil War. You did see some of this social Marxism, this cultural Marxism that you see now taking place here in the United States and in Western Europe. You did see that more or less in the Spanish Civil War. And that created an environment where Spain said no. The military leaders of Spain said, no, we're not going to go down this route. It's not going to happen. We are going to pause democracy, and we are going to save the country. And that's what they did. That's exactly what occurred. And yes, here in the United States, difficult decisions are going to have to be made. Is the right to vote a right that is given to you upon birth? Maybe not. not in the state we are in right now. Bad decisions can be made. Again, 51 people out of 100 decide, hey, we want to jump off a 100-foot cliff into a shallow pool. Should everyone then be required to jump off of a 100-foot cliff into a shallow pool? No. Short answer is absolutely not. And that's what has to be prevented. We must prevent the quote-unquote wisdom of crowds. And there's very, very little wisdom in that crowd, especially when you look at what is creating that person. If we look at what is happening in schools right now, in terms of some of the bizarre, absolutely batshit crazy things that are being taught. I hope at one point, as we proceed into the future, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, history will look back at the whole concept of men dressing up as women and dominating female sports. The idea of large numbers of sexual nationalists marching down the street, scantily clad and nude, accosting children. I would like to say I'm hopeful that we will look back at this fragment of history and ask ourselves, what happened at that point in time? What was going on? When did the adults leave the room and allow anarchists and asocials to take over? Go back to a certain point in history and you hear the term asocial, you hear the term work shy. I now understand. I get it. I understand what was being messaged and why. And once you live in that space and you see what is happening to your country in terms of those asocials attempting to take over, those quote-unquote work-shy individuals, right, that want to live off your money, that want to take from you where they don't have to do anything, where one portion of government simply wants 51% of the population to be reliant on government where they can control your life. No. You have to put your foot down and say, absolutely not. Not going to have it. And if it's 10 out of 100 people who are willing to take up kinetic values and prevent this from happening, then that's the way it has to be. That's the way it has to be. So the path to saving America is going to be tough. It's going to be challenging, but it can be done. And what you're seeing right now in Minnesota is challenging, it's tough, but it has to be done. And it has to be done all across the United States. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.